The rain had been falling since dusk, a steady, merciless curtain that washed the city in gray. Puddles shimmered under flickering streetlights, and the air carried the faint, metallic scent of cold and gasoline. Alexander Grant walked briskly along the sidewalk, his black coat pulled tight against the chill, his polished shoes splashing through shallow pools. Once upon a time, this man had commanded entire boardrooms with his voice alone. The name, Grant, was stamped on luxury towers and real estate headlines across the country. But those days felt like another lifetime. Since his wife Clara's death 2 years ago, Alexander had moved through life like a ghost in a suit. He worked, ate, and slept out of habit, not desire. The house he returned to each night was silent, untouched, a museum of memories he couldn't bear to confront. He avoided people, avoided joy, avoided life itself. He had just left a late business dinner he didn't even remember attending, and his driver was waiting by the curb when a faint sound reached him. A cry. It wasn't the sharp kind of city noise he was used to, no arguments, no laughter, no sirens. This was softer, trembling, almost too fragile to exist in a world this cold. He stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing as he turned toward the narrow alley between two closed shops. The sound came again, a child's voice, breaking under the weight of despair. "Please, someone help me." Against his better judgment, Alexander stepped into the darkness. The alley smelled of damp cardboard and rot. His expensive shoes squelched in mud as he moved closer, guided by that sound until the faint glow of a flickering bulb revealed a small figure huddled against the wall. A girl, no older than 12, soaked from head to toe. Her hair was tangled, her clothes threadbare, and in her arms she held something wrapped tightly in a torn blanket. As Alexander approached, she looked up, her eyes wide with fear but too tired to run. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer than he expected. The girl shook her head, her lips trembling. "No, sir. It's not me, it's my sister." She looked down at the bundle in her lap and gently pulled the blanket back. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Inside lay a smaller child, maybe 5 years old, with pale skin and lifeless eyes that stared at nothing. The stillness of her tiny body told him the truth before he could ask. The older girl's voice cracked as she whispered, "She won't wake up, please, mister, help me bury her." For a moment, Alexander stood frozen, his mind spinning. He had seen death before, he had held Clara's hand as the monitors went silent, but this was different. There was no sterile hospital room here, no doctors, no prayers whispered under fluorescent light. Just rain, cold concrete, and 2 forgotten children the world had already passed by. He crouched down slowly, meeting the girl's eyes. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lila," she murmured. "She's Annie. We were sleeping here." I tried to keep her warm, but, her voice broke, and she pressed her forehead against her sister's tiny shoulder, sobbing. Alexander felt something deep in his chest stir, a feeling he thought had died with Clara. He took off his coat and draped it around Lila's shivering shoulders. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said quietly. "Come with me." She hesitated, clutching her sister protectively. "I can't leave her," she whispered. "We go together." Her determination hit him harder than any business deal or tragedy ever had. He nodded solemnly. "Then we'll bring her. I promise." As the rain poured harder, Alexander lifted the small, lifeless body in his arms, the weight heartbreakingly light. Lila followed beside him, her tiny hand gripping the edge of his coat. To any passerby, it might have looked like a strange procession, a wealthy man carrying a dead child, a street girl walking barefoot through puddles. But to Alexander, it felt like fate's cruel mercy. For the first time in years, he felt something: pain, compassion, purpose. He didn't know who this girl was or why fate had led her to him, but as he placed them gently into his car and told the driver to head home, one thing was certain. The night he met Lila was the night Alexander Grant's heart began to thaw. The drive back to Alexander Grant's estate was cloaked in uneasy silence. The rain had softened into a mist, trailing down the car windows like tears. In the back seat, Lila sat rigid, her small hands clutching the wrapped body of her sister. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, hollow yet burning with a quiet strength that Alexander couldn't look away from. He wanted to say something, anything, but every word felt useless. What could a man who had lost everything possibly say to a child who had lost more? The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the faint sniffles that came from Lila as she rocked slightly back and forth, whispering to the bundle in her lap. "It's okay, Annie, you're warm now." When they reached the mansion, the security lights blinked on, illuminating the vast estate that stood like a monument to Alexander's loneliness. The staff rushed to open the door, their faces filled with confusion as they saw their employer step out of the car, soaked and disheveled, carrying what looked like a child in his arms. "Mr. Grant, sir, what happened?" his housekeeper, Margaret, stammered. Alexander met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "Prepare a guest room. We'll need blankets, and call Dr. Hensley immediately." The older woman, sensing something deeper in his tone, didn't question him further. Within minutes, the grand house that had been lifeless for years stirred with movement. The doctor arrived quickly, but his grim expression told them everything before his words did. "I'm sorry, Mr. Grant," he said softly. "The little one's been gone for quite some time. Severe pneumonia, made worse by exposure and starvation. There was nothing anyone could have done." The words shattered whatever fragile hope Lila had been clinging to. She let out a sound, half cry, half scream, that echoed through the marble halls. Alexander stood frozen as the doctor gently closed Annie's eyes and covered her face. He'd heard that sound before, the sound of a heart breaking. It was the same one he'd made the night Clara's heart monitor went silent. Later, when the others had gone, Alexander found Lila sitting by the fire in the study. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks, and his oversized coat wrapped around her like a blanket. She stared into the flames without blinking. "She always said fire looked like heaven," she whispered. "Said it was warm and bright, like Mama's hugs." Her voice trembled, and she added, "I think she wanted to go there." Alexander swallowed hard. He didn't believe in signs or miracles anymore, but something about the girl's words made him think of Clara, how she used to say the same thing when they'd sit by the fireplace, her hand resting gently on his. He knelt beside Lila, unsure what to do, but certain he couldn't walk away. "Lila," he said quietly, "she deserves a proper place to rest. Somewhere warm. Somewhere safe." Her eyes flickered toward him. "But we don't have money," she said simply. He took a deep breath. "You don't need to worry about that. I'll take care of everything." She frowned slightly. "Why?" The question was so innocent, so piercing, that it silenced him for a moment. "Finally," he said, "because no one should be buried by strangers." The next morning, as dawn broke pale and gold across the estate, Alexander stood beside Lila in the garden behind his home. Beneath a white rose bush, Clara's favorite, they laid Annie to rest. Lila placed a small daisy she'd found by the gate atop the mound of earth, whispering, "Sleep warm, Annie. No more cold nights." Tears burned in Alexander's eyes, though he blinked them away. The ceremony was quiet, just the three of them, Lila, Alexander, and the ghost of his wife watching from the garden she once loved. When it was over, he looked down at the shivering girl and said softly, "Do you have anywhere to go?" She shook her head. "Then you'll stay here, for now." Lila hesitated. "But I'm just a street girl." Alexander managed a faint, tired smile. "And I'm just a man who forgot how to care. Maybe we can help each other remember." As the morning sun spilled across the roses, for the first time in years, Alexander felt warmth that didn't come from fire, but from hope. Days turned into weeks at the Grant estate, and slowly, the quiet halls that had once echoed with emptiness began to fill with something unexpected, life. Lila had been shy at first, unsure of how to exist in a house so large it could have swallowed every street she'd ever slept on. She moved carefully, always asking permission to touch anything, her small hands tracing the edges of polished furniture and framed photographs. Alexander watched her from a distance at first, uncertain of how to bridge the chasm between their worlds. He wasn't used to having anyone around. The staff treated her kindly but cautiously, unsure of what their employer's sudden act of compassion truly meant. But Alexander saw something in her, something pure, resilient, unbreakable, and each day, she reminded him more and more of the man he used to be before grief hollowed him out. He began to notice the small things first, the way she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening, the way she'd arrange the flowers in the garden, or sit beneath the white rose bush where her sister was buried, whispering stories as if Annie could still hear her. It broke his heart, but it also filled it with something new. Compassion. Warmth. A stirring of life he thought he'd lost forever. One evening, as he walked past the library, he found her standing before the tall bookshelves, her head tilted up, eyes wide with curiosity. "You can take one if you'd like," he said, stepping closer. She turned quickly, startled. "I can't read," she admitted softly, almost ashamed. Alexander paused, then smiled faintly. "Then I'll teach you." From that day on, the library became their shared refuge. Each evening, after his work was done, he'd sit with her by the fire, reading aloud from one of Clara's favorite books while she listened with rapt attention. Sometimes she'd fall asleep halfway through, her head resting on his arm, and he'd find himself smiling without realizing it. Other nights, she'd insist on trying to read herself, stumbling over words, giggling when she got them wrong. Margaret, the housekeeper, often watched from the doorway, her heart swelling at the sight. The man who had once lived behind walls of silence now laughed again. One afternoon, Lila found a framed photograph on the piano, a woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to glow from within. "She's pretty," Lila said softly when Alexander entered the room. He followed her gaze, and a wave of emotion passed over his face. "That's Clara," he said quietly. "My wife." Lila looked at the picture again and smiled gently. "She looks like someone who would have liked roses." Alexander nodded, his voice thick. "She did. They were her favorite." Lila traced the glass lightly with her fingers and whispered, "I think she's happy you planted one for Annie. Maybe they're both warm together now." The words hit him like a whisper from heaven. That night, after Lila had gone to bed, Alexander stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. The white roses swayed gently in the wind, and he thought of Clara, her laughter, her kindness, her final breath. He had buried his heart the day she died, certain he'd never feel again. But now, because of a girl who had nothing, he had found everything he'd lost, meaning, tenderness, and a reason to keep living. As days passed, Lila began to smile more. She helped Margaret in the kitchen, learned to read small words, and even painted a picture of the garden to hang by her sister's grave. Alexander often caught himself pausing in doorways, just to watch her. The sound of her laughter filled the house like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lila looked up and asked innocently, "Mr. Grant, are you still sad?" He hesitated, then said softly, "Less than I used to be." She nodded, satisfied, and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then I think my sister's happy," she whispered before drifting off to sleep. In that quiet moment, Alexander realized something profound. He had saved Lila from the streets, but she had saved him from the emptiness that had nearly consumed his soul. The house that once stood as a tomb of memories now breathed again, alive with warmth, laughter, and the faint echo of a love reborn. And for the first time in years, Alexander Grant no longer felt alone. Spring came softly that year, wrapping the Grant estate in sunlight and color. The garden, once a neglected stretch of bare soil, now bloomed in radiant whites and pinks as the roses Clara had once loved flourished again. Lila could often be found there, kneeling by the small grave beneath the white rose bush, talking to her sister in whispers only the wind could hear. Alexander would watch her from the terrace, coffee cup in hand, a faint smile on his face. Every time he looked at her, he saw both the child she was and the miracle she had become. She had walked into his life carrying death in her arms, and somehow, she had breathed life back into his heart. One morning, as they walked through the garden, Lila stopped by the grave and placed a small, wooden cross she had carved herself. "I think she's happy now," she said, brushing the dirt gently from her fingers. "She's not cold anymore." Alexander swallowed the lump in his throat, kneeling beside her. "No," he said softly. "She's warm forever now." Lila looked up at him, her big brown eyes glimmering. "Thank you for giving her a place, Mr. Grant. No one else ever cared about us before." He hesitated for a moment, then placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's not true anymore, Lila. You're not alone now." Over the next few weeks, Alexander found himself thinking constantly about her future. He'd grown used to her laughter echoing through the halls, her drawings taped haphazardly to the refrigerator, and the way she'd run to greet him every evening when he came home. But every time she called him Mr. Grant, a small ache tugged at his chest. She deserved more than kindness, she deserved family. One night, after dinner, he sat her down in the study. The fire crackled quietly between them, casting a soft golden glow. "Lila," he began, his voice steady but warm, "I've been thinking about making this your home. Not just for now, but forever." She blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. "Forever?" she repeated, her voice small. He nodded slowly. "Yes. I want to adopt you. If you'll let me." For a long moment, she just stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You want me?" she whispered in disbelief. "But I'm just a street girl. I don't belong here." Alexander smiled faintly, his own eyes glassy. "Neither did I," he said quietly. "Not until you came." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Then Lila flung her arms around him, sobbing into his chest. "Yes. I want to stay. I want to stay forever." He held her tightly, feeling a tear slip down his cheek, a tear not of grief, but of gratitude. A week later, the papers were signed. The headlines read, "Billionaire Alexander Grant adopts orphan street girl." The world saw it as charity, another headline for the rich man's redemption. But for Alexander and Lila, it was something far deeper. It was healing. It was love finding a way through tragedy. The house that once echoed with silence now rang with laughter and the sound of piano keys as Lila learned to play from Clara's old music sheets. Every corner of the home seemed to glow again, as if Clara's spirit had returned to bless the life they were rebuilding. On the anniversary of Clara's death, Alexander and Lila stood together in the garden beneath the white roses. He laid a bouquet of lilies on the ground, whispering a quiet prayer of thanks. Lila placed a small note beside it, written in her careful, shaky handwriting, "Thank you for sending me to him." Alexander felt tears prick his eyes as he looked up at the sky, sunlight streaming through the branches. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the house filled with warmth and light, Alexander realized something profound. The girl who had once begged him to bury her sister had unknowingly resurrected his own soul. In helping her find peace, he had found redemption. And for the first time since Clara's death, Alexander Grant felt whole again, not as a millionaire, not as a widower, but as a father.